Hey class, today we are going to talk about Nixon, and we're going to talk about Nixon in the world, his foreign policy, and then we're also going to talk about the downfall of Nixon through Watergate. And again, this is outside of the realm of testing for the AP exam. I'm just covering these things briefly. We're not going to spend a whole lot more time on the book. We're going to start reviewing in the near future the concepts that are going to be testable on the AP exam. And also you have access to the College Board daily review lessons, which I very strongly encourage you to watch just to make sure that you are prepared for the AP exam if you are indeed taking the AP exam. Okay, so now let's get right into Nixon and the world. Okay, so Nixon's wanting to make some changes in foreign policy. And, we already talked about Vietnam War and the changes he was making with that. Now let's talk about some other changes that are occurring. One is that in 1972, Nixon was the first president to visit communist China. So after China fell to communism, Nixon's going to become the first president to visit China. And the goal here is to establish relations with China. And the ultimate goal is something called multipolarity. So in the world during the Cold War, we had bipolarity. We had a very strong United States and a very strong USSR. And Nixon thought that that was causing conflict, that if you have just two strong world powers, that they're going to butt heads and it's going to cause conflict internationally. So his idea was multipolarity. Let's pull up at least another world power, maybe two world powers, and let's help to elevate them and establish better trade relationships, establish better diplomatic relationships, get them more involved in the UN and other things like that on a global scale. And hopefully that'll balance power. So instead of just having two powers, we'll have multipolarity, multiple poles, and that will keep any one power from being too aggressive. Now, we can argue whether or not that's a good idea, but we do see Cold War tensions are on the decline. For as far as, if you look at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you look back to the Eisenhower and the Kennedy administrations and the Cold War there, the Cold War under Nixon wasn't really nearly as hot as it was under Eisenhower and under Kennedy. Also, with multipolarity, the work that Nixon did here in 1972 is really one of the reasons why we have such a very strong trade relationship with China today. I mean, most of the things that we buy are made in China, and we have such a strong trade relationship with China because we reestablished relations with them in 1972 with Nixon. So our economy, the reason we can buy so many things at such a low price is because our economy has very strong ties to trade with China. And the cost of production in China is much cheaper than it is here because labor costs are much cheaper. So that's a good thing economically today if you're trying to make a connection. Okay, another thing that occurred in 1972, and this was with the USSR, Nixon had the SALT talks. So this is strategic arms limitation, and this is SALT 1. There are multiple SALT talks. SALT 1, and this agreement on strategic arms limitations was to keep ICBMs, those are intercontinental ballistic missiles, at present levels. So the USSR wasn't supposed to develop any new ICBMs above the current number that they had, and we were supposed to keep our ICBM arsenal at the current level we had it. So that would be seen as a step toward peace. So Nixon is making some progress internationally. So as far as foreign policy is concerned, as far as diplomacy is concerned, Nixon is doing a great job. I mean, if you look concurrently here, Vietnam's still going on. But if you look at the progress that's being made in other areas, he's doing a good job. Now, domestically, yes and no. We're going to start to see some problems, some issues crop up. We're going to see some successes as well. I guess one other thing I wanted to point out internationally is there are some problems with oil, particularly there's tension. If you look at Israel and the Middle East don't always get along, and a lot of Middle Eastern nations don't like Israel, and Israel has to defend itself against attack. and we have a war that goes on, and America supports Israel because Israel is America's ally, and the Middle Eastern oil countries don't take kindly to that, so they're going to put an embargo against us, and that's going to not be a very good thing for us. And quite frankly, part of the reason we keep strategic oil reserves right now in America, part of the reason is so we don't have to deal with that. Now, we do produce a lot of our own oil today, partially because of shale technology and drilling and fracking. Uh, but in this era, that wasn't really the case, and we're dependent on Middle Eastern oil, and they put an embargo on us. That's not a great thing. So we're going to have issues with OPEC periodically. Okay, so domestically, some things that Nixon did. First is Nixon's going to start dismantling portions of the Great Society. All right, so Nixon is not a fan of the Great Society programs, and Nixon, quite frankly, Nixon's very conservative, or is portraying himself as very conservative, and so he doesn't like a lot of social programs. And also, if you look at another thing that occurred, the Warren Court. So Nixon is not a big fan of the current Supreme Court. So the Warren Court is going to be giving a lot more rights to those who are criminally accused. So if you look at Supreme Court cases, so cases like Engel versus Vitale in 1962, or Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963, for example, a huge landmark case that you should know the name of. I mean, quite frankly, you should know all these cases, but one that, as soon as I say the first name, you're going to know the name of this, which is Miranda versus Arizona in 1966. And Miranda versus Arizona is where Miranda rights come from, right? And Miranda takes his case to the Supreme Court, and the court rules that someone who is being interrogated needs to be informed. They must. It is mandatory that they are informed of their constitutional rights. So Miranda confessed to a crime that he had committed, but the reason that he confessed was he said he didn't know he didn't have to confess. And so his appeal goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules that it's not necessarily the individual's responsibility to know their rights, that it's the responsibility of the state to inform them of their rights. And Nixon doesn't really like these cases because it's giving a lot more latitude to those who are criminally accused. Now, I don't know what side of the fence you're on, and that doesn't necessarily matter. As long as you know why you believe what you believe, that's what's important. But as far as the AP exam is concerned, if you want to make connections, so I would look at the Warren Court, and I would compare, if it were me, Warren Court, Taney Court, they seem very similar to me. So if you're looking at courts to compare, and if that comes up, Taney Court and Warren Court, as far as changing the direction the nation was going. Taney overturns the long-standing concept of sanctity of a contract. And then we see here the Warren Court is going to change the idea of what the rights are and responsibilities are of the criminally accused. Before this, it was the person who was accused, it was their responsibility to know their rights. And now it's the state's responsibility to tell them their rights. And Nixon just really doesn't like this. He wants more conservative justices. So when Warren steps down, Berger is appointed. So Chief Justice Berger is going to be appointed in 1969 by Nixon. And he's a more conservative justice, and Nixon is trying to make the courts more conservative. So when he gets opportunities to make appointments, he's appointing more judges that are more on the right, politically speaking. Okay, moving on. Election of 1972, Nixon wins very handily. It's a very easy race for Nixon. I think he gets somewhere over 60% of the popular vote, which is very big. I mean, if you look at the past several elections, the popular vote, maybe 1%, maybe 2% max span between the candidates. Whereas here, he gets 60%, more than 60, it's a little over 60% of the popular vote. So he wins very handily. America really likes the job that Nixon is doing. But then he runs into some problems. And one of the problems that Nixon runs into domestically is high inflation. And you're going to see this is going to cause massive issues. So this isn't just going to be a Nixon problem. This is going to be a Nixon problem, a Ford problem, and a Carter problem. High inflation. Also, you're going to see interest rates are going to skyrocket too. So, I mean, interest rates, on average, they're going to be around 6%. That's not horrible, but if you look at interest rates in America are generally 2%. So it's 3 times what they typically had been, right? And we're going to see interest rates go up, probably, I think it's close to 14, it's around 13% and change, which is really high in America. Did I say interest rates? I meant inflation rates. Inflation rates are going to be really high, but interest always follows inflation. Interest rates are going to peak out at almost 20%. Inflation is going to be really high, and interest is going to be really high too. But for now, inflation's creeping up, which is going to mean interest rates are creeping up as well, and that's going to cause some issues. And we're going to see those are issues that aren't just going to be a Nixon issue. They're going to be a Ford issue, and they're going to be a Carter issue. So they're going to be multi-presidential issues. And they're really not going to be addressed effectively until Ronald Reagan becomes president. Okay, Watergate, this is really the decline and fall of Richard Nixon. So Watergate is going to, the scandal of Watergate, it's not so much that Watergate takes Nixon down, it's Nixon's complicity in the cover-up of Watergate that brings Nixon down. All right, so first of all, if you look at the Trump impeachment, Donald Trump had transcripts of his calls, right? Those are recorded. And Richard Nixon starts recording his conversations. Every conversation that he has, he starts recording and keeping these tapes. And this is going to come back, whereas it came back to help Donald Trump, this is going to come back to hurt Richard Nixon, because there's going to be evidence on these tapes that Nixon was complicit in the cover-up of things that occurred during the Watergate scandal. And also, I mean, there's missing minutes on these tapes. Like, where did those go? It looks like obstruction as well. So Richard Nixon is going to be charged criminally for his role in helping to cover up what occurred with Watergate. Ford is going to pardon Nixon. So when Nixon's going to resign in August of 1974, he's the only president in America's history to resign, ever. Okay? So Nixon steps down because he's going to be impeached. If he doesn't step down, he's being impeached and removed from office. Okay? So we've had 3 presidents impeached, but none of them have been removed. So we've had Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, and Andrew Johnson, and all of them have been impeached, but none of them have been removed from office. But Richard Nixon would have been the first president impeached and removed from office. So instead of being removed from office, he just steps down. But he's still being prosecuted criminally. So Ford is going to pardon Richard Nixon, and that's going to kind of put this whole thing to rest, but it really damages the party's credibility. Ford, for all intents and purposes, was an honorable president, an honest president, not a corrupt president, but the party's credibility was damaged. So people are gonna look at the party and say, well, we're not going to vote Republican in the next election, right? So that really leads to the decline of the party for at least one term, Jimmy Carter for one term, because Jimmy Carter does enough of a job damaging the credibility of the Democrats as far as foreign policy and economic policy, mostly because he blamed, we'll get into it, but he blames America, like the average American, for America's economic problems, which is not really a solid move. But anyway, what I want you to get today, Nixon. Some successes, multipolarity. SALT 1, that's internationally. Problems, OPEC. Some domestic things that were good, right? He would say it was good that he appointed some conservative justices. He would also say dismantling the Great Society was a good thing. Challenges, inflation and interest going up, and then obviously Watergate. Okay, last thing, just by way of review, one thing from Chapter 1, Clovis people. So I really highly doubt you're going to get a DBQ that is going to be pre-Columbian, but you never know. You can have pre-Columbian exploration and pre-Columbian peoples, but Clovis people, They're theorized to be the first settlers in the U.S., although that theory is being challenged currently by a couple of archaeologists. There are a couple claims being made that seem credible that there were people living in America long before the Clovis people. But the Clovis people, your book would say somewhere 11,000-ish plus years ago, people came across the Bering Strait, and they came from Asia to the U.S., and they started settling, and that was where civilization first began in America. So I'm going to start reviewing a little bit at a time with you, and Clovis people is where we started. All right, great job today. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and we'll do some live streams coming up this week. Have a great day.